The photographer was adjusting my veil when my father walked into the bridal suite and said the words that would reshape the entire landscape of my life. "I can't do this. I won't walk you down that aisle today." He wasn't talking about logistics or timing. He was talking about James, and he was talking about the color of his skin. I looked at my father, the man who taught me to ride a bike, who drove me to every dance recital, who I'd loved without question for 31 years. And something inside me went perfectly, crystallinely cold. Then I smiled. "That's okay, Dad," I said quietly. "I was hoping you'd say that." My name is Raven. I'm 31 years old, and this is the story of the moment I stopped being my parents' daughter and became the architect of my own truth. Let me take you back 3 years. I'm a financial analyst in Boston, and I just met James at a conference in New York. He was standing by the coffee station at some networking mixer, and I can still remember exactly how the afternoon light caught his face through those massive windows overlooking the Hudson River. He was reading a book, not scrolling on his phone, but actually holding a book. The title was The Power Broker. I walked up and asked him what he thought of Caro's writing style, and we talked for 4 hours. We missed 2 sessions. By the time I got back to my hotel that evening, I knew I was going to marry him. It wasn't a feeling I was chasing or a conclusion I'd reasoned toward. It was a fact I'd already accepted. My family knew nothing about James when I brought him home for Thanksgiving that year. I'd mentioned I was seeing someone to my mother during a phone call, but I hadn't offered details. When James walked through our front door in Cambridge, tall, warm, with this easy confidence that came from genuinely not caring what people thought, my mother's face did something I'd never quite seen before. It wasn't anger. It was something colder. My father, who was pouring drinks in the kitchen, stopped mid-pour. I watched his hand freeze. I remember the clink of ice hitting glass twice before he finished. My mother asked James about his family. Her questions were polite, but they had edges. Where did his parents live? What did his father do? Was he from a nice area? James answered everything with such grace, such genuine openness, that even as I watched my mother's jaw tighten slightly with each response, I couldn't imagine anyone not liking him. My father barely spoke during dinner. He made comments about the news. He asked James about football statistics. He was performing the role of the hospitable father, but it was a performance, and we all knew it. By dessert, my mother had moved to the real question. She mentioned that they'd always imagined me with someone from a similar background. She said it gently, the way you might mention an allergy, just a fact to plan around. My father nodded. James set down his fork with such careful precision that I knew he'd heard it, processed it, and decided in that moment not to let it land on him. He made a joke about how my family's Irish-Italian heritage was probably more complicated than people realized anyway. Everyone laughed. But I watched my mother's expression, and I understood something in that moment. This wasn't going to be simple. The months that followed were full of small things that added up to something catastrophic. My mother asked me repeatedly if I was sure. My father found reasons to be unavailable when James and I made plans to visit. My older sister Catherine called me during a moment when I was particularly vulnerable, stressed about work, tired from the constant emotional management, and she said it directly. "Mom and Dad are devastated. They thought you'd marry someone like David Morrison. You know, the lawyer's son from the club." I remember standing in my apartment kitchen, holding the phone, and feeling something shift. I stopped trying to convince my family. I stopped explaining James's accomplishments, his kindness, his intelligence. I stopped performing a version of my relationship designed to make them comfortable. When James proposed, I was completely happy. He did it perfectly, on a beach in Maine in October. The ocean, that particular shade of gray-blue that only happens in autumn. He'd written me a letter that he read aloud, and I still have it. What I didn't know was that my father had already decided what he was going to do about it. I found out when my mother called me a week later and suggested, very gently, that maybe James and I should elope. It would be easier, she said. For everyone. She meant for them. For people I barely remembered the names of. For some abstract vision of family honor that, as it turned out, had conditions attached to it like tags on a piece of furniture. My grandmother was the person who changed everything, though she didn't know that's what she was doing. Grandma Vivian was 92, sharp as cut glass, and she had zero patience for pretense. When I brought James to visit her at her house in Hartford, she took one look at him, nodded, and said, "Finally. Your mother brought home that pale banker last year, and I thought I was going to die before you made a good choice." Then she made him help her in the garden for 2 hours, and when we left, she took him aside and hugged him like she'd known him his whole life. That evening, sitting in her kitchen, she told me something I've never forgotten. "Your parents are afraid," she said. "Fear makes people ugly. You need to decide right now if you're going to let their fear become your life. Because once you do, Raven, you might never get yourself back." I thought about those words every day after that. I didn't tell my family about the proposal for 6 weeks. I wanted to be strategic about it. I wanted to have everything planned, the venue, the date, the guest list, so that when I told them, it would feel like a celebration I was inviting them into, not an announcement I was seeking their approval for. I called them on a Thursday evening in January. My mother was silent for so long that I thought the call had dropped. Then she asked if I was pregnant, if that's why I was doing this. My father, listening on the extension, asked if I'd considered the complications this would bring to my career. The complications. As if James existing was a professional liability I hadn't calculated. That's when I started recording everything. I want to be clear about this part because it matters. I wasn't trying to weaponize my family's words against them. I was trying to protect myself. I was trying to make sure that when the moment came, and I somehow knew it would come, I would have documentation of exactly what they'd said, exactly how they'd said it, so that I could never be gaslit into thinking I'd misunderstood their objections. I started recording my mother's phone calls. I documented my father's emails. There were a lot of emails. Some of them were absolutely devastating. One from my father, sent to my mother and Catherine, said, "I cannot in good conscience stand up in front of everyone I know and pretend to be happy about this travesty. Raven has made her choice, but I won't be complicit in celebrating it." The wedding planning became a study in quiet resistance. Every decision was a negotiation. My parents wanted to minimize the guest list. I expanded it. They wanted to avoid any of James's family traditions in the ceremony. I wove them throughout. My father made repeated references to how devastated he was, how this would be the hardest day of his life. I was getting married, and somehow his suffering had become the emotional center of the event. I remember being at a bridal shower, opening gifts, smiling at jokes, and feeling completely and utterly alone in my own celebration. 3 months before the wedding, during a phone call where my mother was asking yet again if I'd really thought this through, I made the decision that would change everything. I called a lawyer. Not for a prenup, everyone assumes it's that. I called a lawyer because I wanted to understand my options. I wanted to know what protection I had if my father, on the actual day, decided to follow through on the statement in his email. I wanted to know what recourse I had if my mother showed up and caused a scene. The lawyer I spoke to, Margaret Chen, a woman my age with steel in her spine, asked me one question. "Do you have proof of what you're claiming?" I showed her the recordings. I showed her the emails. I showed her 3 years of text messages, documenting every microaggression, every cruel question, every attempt to manipulate me out of this relationship. Margaret listened to the recordings, sitting in her office in downtown Boston, just listening. And when she finished, she looked at me and said, "This is documentation of racial discrimination by your parents toward your fiancé. The emotional abuse here is clear. The question is, what do you want to do with it?" I didn't know. I just knew I couldn't walk into my wedding day without some kind of assurance that I had power, that I wasn't a helpless participant in whatever was about to happen. It turns out you can send a letter to your parents via certified mail. You can outline, very clearly, the specifics of their documented discrimination and emotional abuse. You can explain, in measured language, that their attendance at your wedding is conditional on their complete acceptance and public celebration of your relationship with James. And you can include the recordings as attachments. That's what Margaret advised me to do 2 weeks before the wedding. She sent the letter herself, from her office, via certified mail. My parents had to sign for it. My father called me that same evening, his voice tight with something I couldn't quite identify. "Raven, what is this? What have you done?" I didn't answer. I let him ask the question into the silence. I let him sit with the reality of being documented, of being held accountable, of understanding that this wasn't a small betrayal I was going to let slide. The week before the wedding, my mother came to the apartment I shared with James. She sat on my couch in her winter coat and she cried. She told me she was sorry. She said my father was sorry, that he was ashamed, that he wanted to fix this. She said they'd listened to the recordings, all of them, and they understood how they'd sounded. She asked if I would forgive them. Part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to collapse into her apology and pretend the last 3 years hadn't happened. But I'd learned something important during those years. Forgiveness isn't what people think it is. Forgiveness isn't erasing. Forgiveness isn't pretending. So I told my mother, "I forgive you, but I also have a very clear set of expectations for tomorrow, and if either of you deviates from them even slightly, you will not be welcome." I outlined exactly what she and my father needed to do. Arrive on time, sit where they were assigned, smile, applaud, speak to James's family with genuine warmth. No backhanded comments, no sad expressions, no statements about accepting anything. Just actual behavior that demonstrated actual support. My mother agreed. She promised. She left my apartment and called my father, and I heard her through the wall, telling him what I'd said. I heard him be silent for a very long time. The morning of my wedding, I woke up and felt nothing. No excitement, no nerves, no anticipation. Just a strange, clear calm. I put on my dress, ivory, sleek, with tiny crystals sewn into the back, and I let the photographer do her work. And then, at approximately 3:47 p.m., my father walked into the bridal suite. He said he couldn't do it. He said he wouldn't walk me down the aisle because he couldn't pretend to be proud of me for choosing James. He said it quietly, the way you might comment on the weather. But every word was a brick in a wall between us. I had prepared for this. Margaret and I had discussed it. But preparation doesn't change the weight of it. This was my father, standing in front of me, choosing his pride over his daughter, choosing his comfort over my happiness. I looked at him, and I felt a moment of pure sadness. Not for me, but for him. For the life he was about to lose. "That's okay, Dad," I said. "I was hoping you'd say that." He looked confused. I walked to the small table where my phone was sitting, and I held it up. "I've recorded what you just told me. The lawyer has copies of everything, the recordings, the emails, the documented history of discrimination against James. If you don't walk me down that aisle, I'll be filing a formal complaint with your employer regarding the hostile work environment you've created through your racial discrimination. I'll be sending copies of the recordings to everyone at your club, and I'll be sharing all of this with the wedding guests on the way out today, so they understand exactly what you chose and why. He went pale, absolute pale. And then something happened that I didn't expect. My father sat down on the chair in that bridal suite, and he wept. Real tears, real grief. "Don't do this," he said. "Please don't destroy me." I realized in that moment that his fear wasn't about James. His fear was about what other people would think. He'd built an entire identity around a particular vision of who his daughter was supposed to be, and James didn't fit into that narrative. And now, facing the actual consequence of his choices, he was falling apart. I didn't feel vindication. I felt tired, but I also felt clear. "Walk me down the aisle," I said. "Tell everyone that you love James. Tell them that you're proud of me, and then we can all move on from this. But if you don't, I will follow through on every single word I just said. Your choice." My father walked me down that aisle at 4:15 p.m. on April 22nd, 2023. His arm was shaking underneath mine, and his eyes were red, but he walked me down. When we got to the altar, he shook James's hand. He didn't hug him, but he shook his hand, and when everyone applauded, my father clapped with them. James had no idea what had happened in that bridal suite. I didn't tell him until 3 days into our honeymoon in Portugal. We were sitting at a table overlooking the Douro River, and I just started talking. I told him everything: the recordings, the lawyer, the threat. And he took my hand across the table and said, "You did that for me?" I said, "No, I did that for us. I did that because I deserve a father who shows up, and you deserve people who love you without conditions. And our family deserves to begin from a place of truth instead of fear." The fallout wasn't instant, but it was thorough. Within 2 weeks, my mother acknowledged that she needed help processing her own prejudices and started seeing a therapist. My father took an extended leave from work and did the same. Catherine, horrified by what was in the recordings and ashamed of her own complicity, sent me a letter of apology that took her months to write. My grandmother threw a small dinner party celebrating our marriage and made sure James's family felt completely welcomed into the broader family ecosystem. The most important part, though, was what happened internally. I learned that sometimes love has to have conditions, that boundaries aren't cruel, that protecting yourself and your partner isn't selfish, that documentation isn't vindictive, it's survival. A year later, my father asked to have lunch with me. We sat at a restaurant in Cambridge, and he was different. Not transformed. He'll probably always carry some of that fear, that conditioning from his own upbringing. But he was trying. He told me stories about conversations he'd had with James about growing up, about race, about all the things he'd never bothered to learn before. He told me he was angry at himself, not at me. He told me he was proud of me, and he meant it. And for the first time in 3 years, I believed him. I asked him what changed his mind in that bridal suite. He said it was the moment he realized that I was willing to lose him rather than lose James. He said that's when he understood that I'd become a woman who knew her own worth, and that he was about to throw away a relationship with that woman. He said he wasn't about to make that mistake. James and I bought a house in Boston last year. We're talking about having kids. My parents have met with James's parents a dozen times now, and they're actually friends. Real friends, not the performative kind. My grandmother, who is 93, told me at Christmas that watching my family learn to love without conditions has been the greatest gift of her final years. I don't know if my relationship with my parents will ever be what it was before all of this, but I know it's now built on something real instead of something conditional, and that feels like enough. If you've made it this far, you already know something essential. Sometimes the people who raised us have to be taught about love by the lives we choose to live. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to accept less than we deserve. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments what you would have done in my shoes. If you know someone who's standing at their own crossroads, trying to decide whether to honor themselves or honor their family's fear, share this with them today. And if you're new here, subscribe. Another story is waiting. Thank you for being here all the way to the end. I'll see you very soon.